When we factor by grouping, we take the terms that we are given and we separate them into groups based on what is common, so that we can pull out something in common and factor down. For example, let's say we have AM plus AN minus BM minus BN. So you should see some commonalities between the different terms when you're factoring by grouping. For example, these two both have an A in common. These both have a negative B in common. These both have an N in common. These have an M in common. As long as you group them so that you have commonalities, there are multiple different ways that you can group. So let's say we just group the first two and the last two. What is in common between AM and AN? Hopefully you're noticing the A is in common. If I take an A out of both of these terms, I'm left with M plus N. Now when you're factoring by grouping, I'll give you a hint. What you have left over has to match what is left over in the second set of parentheses. So if I had M plus N left over when I pulled out my A right here, M plus N, if I'm going to factor by grouping, I have to have M plus N left over. So the question becomes, what is in common between negative BM and negative BN? That negative B. If I pull out a negative B, I'm left with M plus N. Those match, so we're good. So now we do the exact same thing again. What is in common between A times M plus N minus B times N plus N? That M plus N is in common between both pieces. So we pull out what's in common. In this case, it's the M plus N. And if I take away M plus N, I'm left with A minus B. We're undoing our FOILing. Be careful when you pull something out, in this case our M plus N, you're multiplying that by what's left over. So we pulled out our A, our M, and our M plus N, and we're left with the A minus B. So we're multiplying our M plus N times our A minus B. Let's try again. Two r to the fourth minus 2r to the third minus 7r squared plus 7r. So let's do some grouping. I'll just group the first two and the last two again. You may have noticed other things in common. If I can group the first two and the last two, that's usually my preference because then I don't have to rearrange. So when I look at this, I'm looking at 2r to the fourth minus 2r to the third. And I need to see what is in common. There's a 2 in common, so I'm going to pull that out. And there's r to the third in common. Now when I pull out a 2r to the third from here, I'm just left with r. When I pull out a 2r to the third from here, well, let's look at it. Negative 2r to the third divided by 2r to the third, that leaves us with negative 1, so minus 1. Now we know this has to match. So what is in common between negative 7r to the second plus r to the 7r? So negative 7r to the second and 7r. Well, I need it to be left with r minus 1. Well, I can pull out that 7. I can pull out a common r. But to get it to be r minus 1, I also need to pull out that negative. If you distribute that back, negative 7r times r is negative 7r to the second. Negative 7r times negative 1 is positive 7r. So now we've got it. So now we need to look at 2r to the third times r minus 1 minus 7r times r minus 1 and see what's in common. This r minus 1 is in common between both pieces. So we pull out r minus 1 and we write down what's left over. If I take away r minus 1 from both of these, here I'm left with 2r to the third, and here I'm left with minus 7r. So that would be our factored form. Let's try one more. (12 minus 6q minus 18p plus 9pq). So if I can group the first two and the last two, I will. So that's what I usually make as my preference. So let's try and see if it works. What's in common between 12 and minus 6q? Well, there's a 6 in common, so let's pull that out. If I do, I'm left with 2 minus q. Well, we know that this has to match, so let's see if we can make this 2 minus q once we pull it out. Well, what is in common between 18p and 9pq? Well, there's a 9 in common. I can pull that out. And there's a p in common. But I need this to become a negative right here. So I need to pull out a negative 9. Negative 9p times 2p is negative 18p. Negative 9p times negative q is positive 9pq. So now we look to see what's in common. I have 2 minus q. If I pull out 2 minus q from both pieces, here we're left with a 6. Here we're left with minus 9p. So that would be our factored form, but wait, look at it very closely. See that 6 right there? See that 9 right there? They both have a 3 in common, which means I can take this one step farther. If they both have a 3 in common, that means I can pull a 3 out, so here we're left with 2 minus 3p. So the finished factored form, let's just move that 3 all the way to the front so it doesn't get lost. So there's our 2 minus q, there's our 3, and there's our 2 minus 3p.